everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. My name is Stella Villalba, and I am so happy to join this wonderful spring gathering of the minds. So many educators to learn alongside. Um, it is wonderful to be here. It's one of my favorite days of the year to learn, to be in community with so many people, and to just get better at this art of teaching and learning. Today's topic for that I chose to talk about for myself is Poesias para el Alma, using poetry as a liberatory and sustaining practice for multilingual learners. This presentation will be a multilingual presentation itself. I'll be using, of course, English to present, Spanish, which is my first language, and Guarani, which is an indigenous language from which my family and I are from. So, like I say, my name is Stella Villalba. I am an educator and I reside in Columbus, Ohio. And I've been in education for over 20 years and have the pleasure of growing alongside multilingual learners. So before we get started, I wanted us to center ourselves in this beautiful quote by Mahogany L. Brown: "We're all part of someone else's journey. That's the way communities are built, each root sprawling toward the edge of an infinite smile," which is why I chose the picture of a thread, of a weave, because I believe our connection and our humanity is truly what connects us all. And I am looking forward to spending time looking at how poetry can center and honor the humanity of our multilingual learners in a way that sustains us. So for this work, I invite you to just grab a couple of sticky notes, a journal. I'll be sharing some titles along the way of wonderful poetry that have helped me center and grow as an educator. Before we get started, I mentioned that I live in Columbus, Ohio, is where I reside, and is on the ancestral and current land of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. These people were forcibly removed from their historic lands by colonial settlers during and after the Northwest Indian War, which ended in the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. A land acknowledgement provides opportunity to explore the current impact of colonization. I think that phrase right there, current impact of colonization and systemic oppression on indigenous people. Land acknowledgement do not exist in the past tense or a historical context, as colonialism is current and ongoing process. A way for me to put land acknowledgement in action has been to share some picture books that have helped me understand, learn, grow in my understanding of indigenous communities here in the United States. And here are just some of the titles that have helped me grow in my learning and my understanding, since history, indigenous people's history in the United States is mostly erased in the curriculum. It is important for us to center the voices of indigenous communities, writers, scholars that do this work. So I'm going to just give you a couple more seconds here to look at the different titles or take a screenshot. I also want to do an ancestral acknowledgement. It is very important for me as an immigrant here in the United States to acknowledge my ancestor who made it possible for me to be here through their strength, cariño, perseverance, consejos, intellect, amor y bendiciones. In this picture, I have my maternal grandparents, Abuela Emilia and Abuelo Victor, and my dad, Jose Villalba. And it's so perfect that my dad is at the center of this ancestral acknowledgement, because he is the first person that taught me how to love poetry. My dad owned only one poetry book in his life, and he loved it so much that he read and reread till the point of memorizing the different poems. So he is the one who taught me how to pay attention to words, to language, to the sound and the melody that they bring. I was born, before moving to the United States, I lived in two different countries. I was born in Argentina. My sister and I are from Argentina, and part of my education was in South America, in Buenos Aires. Then at the age of 10, my sister and I, with my family, moved to Paraguay, which is where my dad and my mom are from. Highlighting here Maestra Irma, my first grade teacher, who taught me how to read, how to pay attention to words, how to notice in them, how to keep a notebook and a journal and start collecting words. When we moved to Paraguay, where my mom and my dad are from, and my family, most of my family are from, I moved to a country where there are two official languages, Spanish and Guarani. Guarani is an indigenous language, and the country has fought very hard to keep this indigenous language at the center of their education. So Paraguay is the only country in South America with two official languages. So because this is a poetry workshop and because we are centering the life of multilingual learners, I want to make sure that I also honor poetry in my full linguistic repertoire, which will be Spanish and Guarani in this case. So I'm going to read a poem in Guarani from my godson's poetry book from school. Guarani is a language that they learn in school, in elementary and middle school and high school. And so I want to honor my ancestor. I want to honor my dad. And I chose this poem about a butterfly, because butterfly represent migration, represent movement, action, represents our immigrant, my immigrant myself, and represent our dreamers. Panambi ikateva, Panambi ikateva, o bebé jaujo, bae por aiteva, o yecha ipepo, o paiteo hasaba, o momaitei, peina o mimbipava, ija oñanduti, hobu, sejuva, buta, moroti, y marangatuba copanambimi, o weyuma vipe, Hoima hawa, ipepe porendipe, ivotu onyuva, ha pepe onyemomora, ha ekatu upepe onyembo tusha. I also grew up with the poetry of the wonderful Argentinian writer, Maria Elena Walsh. So my first love for poetry came in my first language. Un hipopótamo tan chiquitito que parezca de lejos un mosquito, que se pueda hacer upa y mirarlo con lupa, debe ser un hipopotamito. The beautiful sounds of words. I think about the privilege I have of being surrounded of poet and poetry in my first language. And of course, when I moved to the United States and became an immigrant for the second time, I came and look at the world through the lenses of my students who are multilingual learners, who come from different parts of the world, who have beautiful words and sounds in different languages. And I started thinking about how are they processing their language? What kind of poetry are they reading? Do they see their experiences in themselves in those poems? How are we honoring and holding space for all their different identities, their ways of being, and their ways of knowing through the wonderful work of poetry? And as I started wrestling with these questions, I started reading more and more the literature that is offered here in the United States. And of course, is how I learned about Juan Felipe Herrera, our former US National Poet Laureate. And the book Imagine is a book that you will always see me talking about when I do PDs, either in my district or around the United States. I'm always in conferences, always talking about this book, because the next Juan Felipe Herrera is sitting in our classroom. Also because this story acknowledges and centers the brilliance and the gift that our students, our multilingual learners bring. They don't come empty-handed in the United States. A lot of them are born in the United States. A lot of them are moving here from different parts of the world. And in the story, we learn about Juan Felipe's story when he moved to the United States and how he knew the words and the sounds in his first language, in Espanol. And when he was learning English, he started to become a word collector because he's learning how to pay attention to words in a new language, which has its own melody and its new sound. And how, once you know how to pay attention to words, you can start using creativity, imagination to create poems that center your experiences. And one day you will give a big speech in the Library of Congress. This is the story of someone who is showing us all the different gifts that they brought into this country. And I always tell our teacher, remember, just our next Juan Felipe Herrera is sitting in our classroom. And it's important to honor all who they are. As I continue my journey in thinking about who are the writers, the people that are helping me understand also the experience here in the United States and who are centering the voices and experiences of our multilingual learners. I am in awe of Aida Salazar, Elizabeth Acevedo, Margarita Engel, and of course, Alma Florada for their contributions into children's literature. And the way that when I read these books, I see myself, I see my community, mi gente in these pages, and I come alive. And I think about how important it is for our multilingual learners to be surrounded not only with beautiful poetry, but with poetry, prose, free verse that honors who they are and say, I see you, kid, and you matter. I want to read, I mentioned that this presentation is a multilingual presentation. And there's this beautiful poem written by Alma Florada, bilingual, bilingue, and that I would love to read out loud, and I'll read the Spanish version. Porque hablo español, puedo escuchar los cuentos de mi abuelita y decir familia, madre, amor. Porque hablo inglés, puedo aprender de mi maestra y decir I love school. Porque soy bilingüe, puedo leer libros y books, tengo amigos y friends, disfruto canciones y songs, juegos y games y me divierto el doble. Y algún día, porque sé hablar 2 idiomas, podré hacer el doble de cosas, ayudar al doble de personas y hacer todo lo que haga el doble de bien. Alma Florada. When I read this book, I think about the wonderful work and contribution of Ofelia Garcia, Doctora Carla España, Doctora Luz Yadira Herrera, as they center Latinx voices and experiences in the curriculum, and honoring translanguaging, our full linguistic repertoire, into our everyday being. And how beautifully written this poem represents that. I continue immersing myself in the world of literature as an immigrant myself, as an educator, as a multilingual learner myself. And how can I talk about poetry without talking Jose Olivares? This wonderful book. Ay, Jose, mil gracias. Qué belleza. A bilingual poetry book. Bilingual in the same book. On one side, Español, Promesas de Oro. En la otra parte, on the other side, Promises of Gold in English. Absolutely beautiful. Absolutely testimonial work. And then I go back to the children. I go back to thinking, what are they reading? What are we centering? What experiences? And I think about Francisco Alarcón. Oh, what a wonderful way to leave words, to leave a trail in the pages of a book. Angels ride bikes, Los Ángeles andan en bicicleta. Family poems for every day of the week. All of this beautiful book that are bilingual, Spanish and English, that honors our culture and our community. And I, of course, I want our multilingual learners to experience la belleza, las palabras, the work of Francisco Alarcón. And how can we not, if we're talking about poetry, how can we not talk about Amanda Gorman, whose voice, whose beautiful language made such an impact on all of us, affirming that poetry is a way to sustain ourselves, that poetry is a way to liberate us. The art right here is by amplifier.org, which is a wonderful amplifier. Yes, amplifier.org is a wonderful nonprofit that provides amazing artwork, art activism, and a lot of free resources for teachers. So I highly, highly recommend. And a book that helped me put all of this together, how I'm reading the world through my own lens, how I'm reading the world of poetry through the lens of my multilingual learners. And then this book who was edited by Django Paris and Sami Alim is a contribution of so many different scholars writing about cultural sustaining pedagogy. And one of the things that they write is about how cultural sustaining pedagogy is indeed about providing our children with the opportunities to survive and thrive, but it's also centrally about love, a love that can help us see our young people as whole versus broken when they enter schools, and a love that can work to keep them whole as they grow and expand who they are and can be through education. What a powerful way to think. What an affirmative, strength-based, rooted in strength approach of looking at our students as people that are whole and how to keep them whole while they're going through our educational system, right? And I take their invitation to think deeply about cultural sustaining pedagogy and how to bring that into the classroom, in the how to embed this pedagogy in everything that we do and everything that we teach, in how we lead, in how we hold community, how we create community, how we coexist and co-create. And I think about how Casey Wong and Courtney Pena, who are two scholars that are also contributed to this wonderful book, talk about cultural sustaining pedagogy is about complicating, sustaining, and extending what is important to students in their life, not just what's important to educators and their agendas, whether their agendas are social driven or not. It is about centering their lives, sustaining their lives and who they are and what is important to them. And like I mentioned, esta presentación es multilingual because there's so many pieces of me and there's so many ways I communicate. And wouldn't that be beautiful that our students can also have that opportunity to do so in school? As Buchholz, Casilla, and Sukli reminds us, language and culture are not only resources to be sustained, but are themselves forms of sustenance that nurture their identities of young people of color. So today, for this presentation, what I've been doing is sharing with you my journey as an immigrant myself, coming from a different country with a different language. And once, I become an educator, how do I hold space in my classroom so that our students, our multilingual learners, can have access to poetry in different languages, in different ways, and process the words and poetry as something that sustains them, as something that liberates them. So what I want to share with you is something that I did, and this is one of the many ways that this can be done. Consider this an invitation. One of my favorite things to do is to host Poetry Cafe with our multilingual learners. And the guiding question, and again, this is an invitation. Maybe this is something that will inspire you to host, because poetry is for any time of the year, not just April. It's for any time. It should be read all year round. And the two guiding questions that I had for me, that I want to extend to you, were written by Casey Wong and Courtney Pena in the book Cultural Sustaining Pedagogy. And they ask, how can we provide spaces for young people where they're not defined solely or overwhelmingly by their marginalization? And on that same note, how can we provide spaces for young people to extend and imagine joy? Imagine joy, your identities, your experiences validated. So one of the things that I love to do is just to immerse my students all year round on beautiful poetry, very intentional poetry. I want them to read widely and deeply in different languages, different voices, different format. And there is no rush. They understand that this is a process, and that the process of learning a language and the process of reading poetry is very similar. We take our time with it. We learn to savor the words and we let them come to us. So this beautiful, I mentioned Margarita Engel earlier in my acknowledgements too. I love this poetry book, Bravo, Poems About Amazing Hispanics, because it is important for our multilingual learners to understand how people from around the world are leaving their mark in the world, and what are they doing, and what medium do they choose to do that work. So you'll see here in the pictures, students are just being engaged in work, in poetry work. They're just reading. And what they have with them is a couple of sticky notes, always with sticky notes around. And as they read book, they mark. If they connect with a poem, they put their name and they leave it there. We don't do anything else yet. We are just reading. And after being immersed for a while, through lots of different poetry books and formats and authors, I ask our students to start looking through the books for those poems that they once mark and go back to those and reread. There's so much beauty in rereading. There is so much power in rereading words, in let it come to you again, and what kind of emotions bring up this time. And so what I ask our students to do is to really sit with the question of why this poem? Why is this poem speaking to me? And I invite them to journal, just to write, what is it about this poem that makes me think or feel in a certain way? When I read the poem about the butterfly in Guarani, I told you what it represents for me, the dreamers in migration. And so I'm connecting deeply with that symbol, right? So I model this for them, and then they get to do it themselves. And this is all year. The Poetry Cafe event is a culminating event, but all through the year they're immersed in the world of poetry, and they're making choices and reflecting on those choices. So what I ask students to do is, as they read poetry book, and they can read it by themselves, they can read it with somebody, they can listen to it. There's so many different ways. I ask them to go back to those poems, the ones that they really, really connected with. Some of them have wrote those poems in their journals because there's such a beauty in writing them down. Some others just put the sticky notes and they go back, and what they do is they type those poems, and they learn how to cite their sources, right? Who wrote this book? What's the title of the book? When was it written? Important information we should always know and acknowledge, right? And so I ask our learners in preparation for this poetry cafe to think about, if you were to present a self-portrait poetry poster of yourself, what poems will be included in there? Why? What is the story you will tell your audience through those poems? Why do they speak to you? And they have to be very intentional. And there are two things that happen in this process as they select poems that will go on their self-portrait poster. Is they have spent a lot of time with poetry, and they have internalized it in the way we read poetry, but also internalize the beauty of the language itself. And the other thing that also happens is, I've seen our multilingual learners writing poems in their first language. They have read so much, they have been immersed in so much reading of poems that they feel confident with the genre, and they're ready, naturally ready to give it a go, which is the ultimate gift, right? So their poetry, self-portrait posters, is a combination of found poems in different books that they have marked throughout the years, and it's a combination of poems that they have written that represent themselves, their lived experiences, their identities, traditions, things they want to hold on to, memories. And of course, there's always art, because it's a wonderful way to honor and represent your students. And what we do with this, it's a process. All of this, the Poetry Cafe is a culminating event. They're engaged in poetry, like I said, all year round. So this is an ongoing work of months, right? So when the night, the evening comes, where we're all presenting the work and we're all sharing it with a wider audience, what everybody gets to see is a collection of poems, and how do those poems speak about my life, and why am I making that connection? So what the audience gets to see is a couple of things. They get to see the self-portrait posters all around the cafeteria, centering their voices, their experiences, their languages. As you can see, there's a beautiful row there of self-portrait poems that they have created. But it's also an opportunities for the families to come together. And the other thing that I love our students that they get to do is they get to recite poems, and they get to recite in the language that they want. And families come together and they feel so seen, so acknowledged, so validated, because they see themselves in the pages, in the words, in the poems, in the posters. There's so many different entry points so that families can participate as well. Another thing that we present to the families is their own poetry books. These are their journals. These are the way that they have come about their writing. They have come about understanding poetry and making sense of it. And it's all them. It's 100% them. It's their tries, it's their own ways of giving poetry a go. One other aspect of the culminating activity is empowering our audience to engage with our readers, with our poets, with our learners in a way that centers them, because they are the poets of the night. And so one small thing that marks such a big difference is allocating and holding space and time for families, for our students to go around and read the different works that our wonderful poets have done. But not only that, but also providing them feedback, taking the time to read and to notice their works so that they can say, oh, I read your self-portrait poster, and I can tell that grandma is a very special person for you. O qué lindo que es ver que te gusta tanto compartir con tus primos, right? All these different ways, because there isn't an access point for everyone. They have a way to connect with the person who created this. And that's the power of the audience, right? Is who is bearing witness to the work, to my thoughts, my creation, my growth. And we talk and spend a lot of time thinking about this as a community. The staff that gets invited, the families that come in, the siblings that come in and read the poster, and that just taking the time to honor that. One very simple way that we have done this idea of providing feedback to the reader, to the poet, to the writer, is by creating these postcards where families and students could just take one and write and leave a note card with an appreciation note to the writer. And as a community of writers and learners, we learn how to do this, how to pay attention to somebody's work, so that we're not just giving surface level feedback like, I love your work, but actually saying, that poem about baseball, that brought me back some great memories about summer. I love that you chose that poem. Or, yes, I love Aida Salazar too. She's a great writer. Those are the kind of specific comments we invite our audience, especially our students, to do, but also our families and our staff. So the idea is that everyone will get something. And the one thing that I do want to make sure I say is that this invitation to host a poetry event that is as a culminating activity, it's all run by the students. They're the one reading the poetry, marking the pages of a book, creating the invitation, writing the posters, decorating, coming up with the ideas. They're creating their posters. We are providing, as educators, we provide books that truly represents many different stories and ways of being, that provide voices, that provide languages. And we hold space for them to just spend a good time reading every day and reflecting on their choices. There's so much learning and there's so much power. I hope that today's session on Poesias para el Alma just give you a bit of inspiration, a bit of dreaming with possibilities and envisioning the work with our multilingual learners, and to really rethink of poetry as a way that sustain us, as a way that liberate us, as a way that affirm us. So I go back, I want to finish it up with that same invitation from this book, Cultural Sustaining Pedagogy, of like, how can we provide spaces for young people where they're not defined by their hurt, their marginalization, but actually, how can we provide spaces for them that extend and expand joy? What a beautiful concept to discover and to spend time with. And an intentional selection of children's literature will allow us to do so, but also amplifying our lenses para que haya muchos idiomas, so we can have a lot of different languages in our classroom, and that our students have access to that. I hope you stay in touch. My blog is teachingcoachinglife.com, where I write and try to make sense of teaching and learning and ask myself questions and center the beauty and the brilliance of our multilingual learners. I'm also leaving my email address, so if you want to stay connected, we can do so. Or if you found beautiful poetry or beautiful ways to continue to sustain our multilingual learners' stories and identities, please share them with me. It would be an honor to hear from you. I hope you continue to have a fabulous, wonderful learning date and with the Ed Collaborative. And thank you. Don't forget to use the hashtag, the Ed Collab Gathering, so that we can all learn and we can all keep track and of our learning and center and lift one another. Have a beautiful, wonderful rest of your day.